Hello, and welcome to A Crucial Conversation on Racial Equity, Part 2. I'm Linda Seppa-Salisbury, and I'm a Communication Studies teacher at Spokane Community College. It's my honor to welcome you to this important dialogue. Part 1 of A Crucial Conversation on Racial Equity took place this last fall, and the emphasis of that dialogue was primarily about racial equity issues for African Americans. Part 2 is a little different. You'll be hearing incredible cultural stories, along with looking at racial equity issues for other ethnicities, such as Asian Americans. We're very grateful for our sponsors. Those include Spokane Community College, Speak Out, SCC's Communication Club, and the Business and Professional Communication class taught by Dr. Amy Anderson. So thank you so much for being here. We hope this is a useful and important time for you, and welcome again to A Crucial Conversation on Racial Equity, Part 2. Good morning. It's good to see all of you here, and good morning to those of you who are watching this. We're delighted to be doing the Crucial Conversation number 2, and it's a crucial conversation on racial equity. And this morning we have some esteemed folks here with us and who are going to be sharing their life stories and their experiences, and we're so happy to be able to share those with you. So on my right, this is Dr. Lori, and she is the Dean of Student Success here at Spokane Community College, Dr. Lori Hunt. And that's Guillermo Espinosa, who is the new, we're so excited, director of the Equity Project and the Equity Center and Inclusion, and you are the director of that. That's wonderful. And this is Grace Leaf, who is one of the treasures of Spokane Community College and the community college system. We all agree about that. And she is working with HR and employment there for the district office. This is Dr. Scott Finney, and he is the Director of Africana Studies at Eastern Washington University and one of the finest individuals on the planet. And the one and the only Betsy Wilkerson, who is our voice on the Spokane City Council and just an amazing person. So these are the people who are sharing this morning, and it's a courageous thing that you're doing because, as we know, these are sometimes kind of tough conversations to have with other people, and we're hoping that this conversation will be an eye-opener and a heart-opener for lots of people who get to see it. So going first is Grace Leaf, and she's going to talk a little bit about some guidelines, not only for this conversation for us, but also guidelines for people who are watching who might have a difficult conversation about racial equity.
Absolutely.
Grace.
Good morning. What I want to do is to commit on behalf of our panel to bringing our best selves to this conversation, to be kind and generous, and to stay engaged and listen with empathy. Be open and suspend judgment, and we all commit to speaking our own truth and not speaking on behalf of others or assuming ill intent when someone else is speaking. And I think if we can do that, then we can step into a brave space and co-create a community of conversation where the obedience to the truth is practiced.
Thank you so much. So to better know each of you, we've asked if you would, in 3 to 4 minutes, share a little bit about your cultural story. And I think what that does for those who are watching is it gives a context for a lot of your comments, and they get to know you a little bit more personally. So, Lori, would you be the first to do that, please?
Yes, I would be happy to do so. Thank you, Linda. So my story began in a small logging community in Eastern Washington. And so I am biracial. My mother is from Africa, and my father is from Spokane area, and that's where my journey began. So I grew up in an all-white community. I've been in Washington my entire life, and I've learned so much about our different regions. I've learned a lot about myself through my educational journey, but it really was, growing up on a farm. Most people don't know that I grew up on a farm, and it was a wonderful experience. And so, being in the small rural community, moving into the bigger city, and then experiencing life outside of the area has really given me a lot of opportunities to understand other cultures, to understand how people communicate, and to learn. And that's one of the things that brought me to education, was taking the opportunity to continue that learning and to work with others to help them continue to learn and continue to grow. And so that's my journey. I have I lived outside of Spokane. I came back to Spokane, and now I'm here at the community colleges. I've worked in private institutions of higher ed, and I've just always been brought back to these opportunities like the community college that provide the access for individuals to just learn and to grow and to do things that will support their families and their communities. And so that is my brief. I still got a lot more to add to my journey, but that is where my story began here in Eastern Washington.
Thank you so much. Guillermo.
Good morning, and thank you, Linda, for having me on stage and
It's our pleasure.
sharing my story with all of you. Like Linda said, my name is Guillermo. I grew up in Leavenworth, Washington, actually a little tiny town right outside of Leavenworth called Peshastin. Probably the reason it's a town is it has a post office and a tavern and one road. So that's where I grew up. My parents immigrated here from Mexico, from Michoacan, Mexico. And I grew up learning Spanish first. And I think that's an important part of my story because I grew up bilingual. And people often say, oh, you were so lucky to learn Spanish because I want to learn Spanish. But what they don't understand is that as I was growing up, I was learning Spanish at home, and my parents insisted that we only speak Spanish. And then at school, I was learning English, but there was no time to practice either one because I couldn't practice my English at home and I couldn't practice my Spanish at school. So it was growing up learning two different languages. Now that I'm an adult, I appreciate it so much, but growing up, it was a challenge with school, feeling like I wasn't smart enough with the other kids because I was behind on English, and then at home having trouble communicating with my parents because I was still learning Spanish but had nowhere to practice. So that was part of my journey. And then I graduated from Cascade High School, which is in Leavenworth, and then I came to Gonzaga. And that was my real first experience outside of rural America, outside of a small town. But I wanted to share my story about my first time I felt like I was different than other people. I was actually in 4th grade, and so one of my actually close friends comes up to me and says, Guillermo, do you get to eat Mexican food every day? And I was like, what do you mean Mexican food? And she's like, well, like enchiladas and tacos and all that Mexican food that I love, you get to have it every day? And I said, well, that's just dinner. It's just food. It's not Mexican food. It's just food. And so that got me thinking, what do you eat at dinner? Because I thought everyone ate beans and rice and enchiladas. And she was like, no, that's like when we have Mexican food for dinner, usually. And I was like, so do you have casseroles or burger? Like, I'm so confused as to what dinner looked like at somebody else's house, because what I knew to be true was Mexican food was just regular dinner food. And that's really when I encountered that first interaction where I was like, oh, I'm not the same as my friends at school. We don't have the same cultural backgrounds. We have different experiences. And so that's something that I brought with me to college. And at college, I also continued to learn because I had this experience growing up in Leavenworth. It's a big agriculture town. There's lots of pears, peaches, cherries, and that's when my parents moved there from Mexico, was to work in the fields. And when I got to Gonzaga, I saw other Hispanic, Latinx folks. And I just assumed that because everyone back home was from Mexico, that all of my fellow students were also from Mexico. And I found out rather quickly that when I said, oh, us Mexicans, people were like, well, no, I'm from El Salvador, or I'm from Honduras, or parents are from Cuba. And so I had to really take that home and reflect on it and think, you know, not everyone, even if we do look the same or have similar traditions, not all of us are from the same regions or areas.
Thank you so much. Grace.
I was a Korean adoptee, and I was 6.5 when my single mom from Korea gave me up to 2 English teachers from America. And on November 30th, I go to bed speaking Korean, dreaming in Korean, knowing myself as Sungmin. On December 1st, I wake up, my new parents are there, and they're speaking English, and I literally have no one else to talk to or make sense of my new reality, and they're calling me a new name, Grace. So my Christian name is Grace Elizabeth, which means gift consecrated to God. So no pressure from the very beginning. And so I stepped into this new life, not of my choice, but because of a sacrifice my mother made, because she, as a single woman in Korea without an education, could not support me. And she made that sacrifice out of courage because she had to leave a violent alcoholic marriage. And she was the 3rd wife to my biological father, who I never knew existed until my 35th birthday, when I got a package, and it was from my brother that I didn't even know that I had. And he wrote in English that, I'm your brother, and I remember carrying you on my back. And I was 14, and you were a baby, and then our stepmom left. And I didn't know what happened to you. And my father finally convinced her to give me your address. And this is on my birthday with my adopted parents in my backyard. And all of a sudden they're asking, well, is this your half-brother or your full brother? And I said, 30 seconds ago, I didn't even know I had siblings. I was always told that I was the only one. So when you go through life thinking you're an only child, and then you're an older child to another adopted sibling, you have different assumptions about your birth order and where you fit in a family. And all of this took place in a little town called Addy, Washington, population 291. And I went to school in Chewelah, where my dad taught English and computer science and math. He was out of that culture. He homesteaded there, his family did. So we had 100 acres, and like Lori, I grew up on a farm, doing chores, knowing how to shoot a .22 if the black bear in the yard got unruly because he'd bathed in our natural water spring. But then it wasn't just a rural upbringing. My adopted mom was born on Lanai to very wealthy Japanese parents who came from Japan and owned property in Japan as well. And her name was Faith, and she was one of 7 children. And when she was 15, they were sitting at the breakfast table on a Sunday morning, 7 a.m., and American soldiers with bayonets came into the house and marched her father out. And he was temporarily housed in Hilo and then moved to an internment camp in Arizona. And the rest of the family was there in Lanai, not knowing where he was, until the Red Cross intervened and allowed people to have mail. But all of his letters had holes cut in them. So no one could really know the level of atrocity that those folks had endured in those hot internment camps. And that story did not come alive for me until I was a doctoral student at Gonzaga. My mom had never told me about her family history because it was full of shame, and she couldn't talk about it. But it made so much sense when I thought back to all those nights where she was screaming in her sleep, and now it made sense. And so during the pandemic, where we had nothing but time on our hands, and my day job is to make sure that everybody is bringing their best selves to the community colleges on behalf of students. And when I wasn't on Zoom for 10 hours a day, I was doing my own work, researching what intergenerational trauma meant for our family, and talking about myself as an Asian in America and what that meant, because growing up in Addie, you didn't have labels like Asian. You were just Grace, and the only one, the first one. So the spotlight's always been on me, and that glare was sometimes oppressive and scary and a lot of pressure. But as I got my education, as my parents supported me through all of that, I remember that the power of education is why we're here, and it can transform lives. And so the sacrifices that my mom made, my birth mom, and my adoptive parents, the legacy that they've created for me, so that I could have a better life here and do for others as they did for me.
Thank you so much. Scott.
That was beautiful. When it comes to a cultural story, I'll just try and break it down to a basic kind of tension that I experienced growing up. And that was being African American in a country where we're, as a population, about 13% of the family that's called America. And I think the best way to sum it up would be double consciousness. What W.B. Du Bois described as the inner conflict of growing up in a country where you're always questioning, am I black or am I American? And of course the big question is, can I be both, or does one come at the expense of the other? And so there's always this inner conflict going on, as Du Bois explained. And of course, Malcolm X is the person that answered that question and said, no, you have to sacrifice one for the other. This is not allowed in this country. And because of that, of course, Dr. King said, of course you can be both. And so there's always this tension going on. I grew up in the 1960s in Oakland, California, an extremely urban experience, unlike my colleagues on the right. And growing up in the 60s was an amazing thing. But I would say, as the youngest of seven, 6 boys and 1 girl, my family left a great impression on me as regards to what is life all about. And I would say that as a typical African American grew up in an urban setting, we were seeking 3 things. Self-identity, which is something that seemed to be floating and coming and going. You're not sure what you're told at school, you're not sure what you're hearing at home. And so that was a big one. And then also this idea of self-expression. Very, very crucial to any human being. And thirdly, self-achievement. And for me, as most African Americans growing up in the Bay Area at that time, the idea of self-identity was determined really by people like Malcolm X, and of course the Black Panthers had a lot to do with that. My cousin, who was Huey Newton, one of the co-founders of the Black Panthers in 1966 there in Oakland. And part of the problem was the police relationship with people of race. And I think that's what's kind of happening today again all over after all these years. We're almost at the anniversary of the George Floyd murder. And when I grew up, even as a 15-year-old with my permit and driving my parents' car, I had to keep the proof of insurance and, of course, the proof of title ownership anywhere except in the glove compartment. And usually we kept it above with the visor. Because, especially at night, if you're African American in Oakland, California, and you reach for your glove compartment when they ask for such documents, the typical thing was you got shot. And as a 15-year-old, innocent 15-year-old, not even able to know really what I'm all about, that's the kind of conditioning I was put under because of the situation. So when it comes to self-identity, I looked completely at people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. On the side of self-expression, growing up in the Bay Area in the 60s, that was all a matter of music. what James Brown did with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, or Marvin Gaye later in the 70s, What's Going On, or the Isley Brothers, Fight the Power, you know. All those things became not just anthems outwardly, but they became anthems of self-expression. And then in the area of self-achievement, because of the constant racial oppression that was just understood, not even talked about, achievement was not an area that was that easily pursued, but it was never in the area of education. It was in the area of sports. We all grew up thinking the only way out is by becoming a star basketball player, football player, or baseball player. And of course, we had all the stars right there professionally doing those things. So I came up here to Gonzaga University. I played point guard for Gonzaga in the late 70s, but my thought was to go on to the NBA. And that was the aspiration of all of us. But I have to say, eventually I found out education is the key to grassroots changes. And I think we're going to hear more about that even, and I'm sure as all students look at this, there's hope, there's potential, there's capacity, and it can be reached. And education is the foundation and the base. And luckily, I'm in a situation where, as an educator at Eastern Washington University since 1992, I get to plant that seed into many a people. And that's what, to me, is life all about. Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
Betsy.
Well, first of all, I want to say to everyone watching, it just reaffirms that you don't know anybody's story. We all, to most, look extremely successful and look like we just got here overnight and didn't have any hardships to get here, but we all had some hardships. So please realize it is a journey to wherever you are determined to go. So Betsy Wilkerson, my mom brought me and my siblings here in 1963 from West Point, Mississippi. That's just down the road from Tupelo, because West Point's not really on the map. No stop sign, no stoplight. But she came here to Spokane with us on a train. So here's a single black woman with 4 children on a train going across the country in 1963. I remember it like it was yesterday. She had a basket of fried chicken, she had some bologna, she had a pound cake and some bread, and why we didn't get salmonella, I can't tell you why, because it was not refrigerated. So we get to Spokane, and my mom was a black hairdresser. She had a friend here, and so she came here to work doing hair. We grew up in the church. That was my education. You know, the preacher was the teacher. And so that was instilled in me. And then both my parents became teachers. I left and went to a HBCU, so broke the Gonzaga story. Came back to Spokane as a single parent because I had support here. So now I'm a single mom with 2 kids in Spokane, and I start my own journey. And you know, the opportunities, and especially for folks of color in Spokane, it is different because we don't have critical mass of folks of color. We have to accept our help where it comes from, and the good intentions of what we didn't call them allies back then. I don't think we've even coined that, but we just call them friends who were invested in our outcome. So I go to work in the banking industry. I was a teller back in the day. Didn't have many black tellers. We don't have many now. But that being said, I met folks who invited me in, and my daughter was in Girl Scouts, so I did scouting. So I started this life of volunteering. And during that time, my parents had started a small business. So they opened what you call now an adult family home. It's assisted living, and they were taking care of people who were mentally ill. My parents got sick and said, Betsy, you should come take this on. I'm thinking, oh, I don't think so. But I was a dutiful daughter, and We all know how that works in the communities of color. And I took to it like a duck takes to water. So taking care of other people really just changed the trajectory of my life, because I saw what I did made a difference every day. And by being self-employed, I was able to bring my children to work with me, because childcare is critical. And so, y'all know adult family homes, assisted livings are 24/7. I could take them to work with me. I did that. That opened other doors. I continued my opportunity in volunteerism, but it was a lonely journey here in Spokane, because I was always the only one of color in the room. And then that led me to this opportunity last year to be appointed to Spokane City Council. Again, the only person of color in the room. And the challenges that has brought, when we're leaders of color, people expect us to represent for everybody. But I jokingly say, I can hardly take care of myself. So, just trying to take care of a whole community of black people is impossible. Probably the same for all of y'all, too. But being able to speak and be in that space and the opportunities to make a difference in higher ed is amazing. But every day you are learning. And that is the experience that you need to intertwine with your higher education to get where you want to go. It was important to me as a single mom that both my kids went to college, because I knew that was the next level for them. And for all of you out there watching, it will be the next level for you in your life. So again, thank you for being here, and the stories that you shared were amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. What amazing stories. So we're going to tackle some of the wonderful questions that came from faculty and from students. And Grace, we'll start with you. The question was asked, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been an increase in hate crimes against the Asian American community. What can we do to support and protect this community?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important to recognize who we're talking about when we talk about Asians. Asians make up 60% of humanity. So they span several continents. So it's the Indians of subcontinent all the way to the Philippines, to China, Korea, Japan. So it's a very diverse people when we talk about Asians. And that comprises 4.3 billion people in our planet. So when we talk about Asians in general, we're talking about a lot of people, and that's why I don't represent all Asians. And when we talk specifically about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, they identify differently because of all of those different places from where they hail. And right now, there's been a 169% increase in hate crimes against Asians. And that was a study that looked at the macro data that was released this week. And what that's talking about is when a person sees someone who may look Asian, and the person assumes that person is Asian, that they see them as the other. And somehow, they're partly to blame for this China virus or the Kung flu or some other derogatory term, and that rhetoric has seeped into our consciousness. So the first thing to do is recognize, what are you hearing? And listen differently. What's the language that's out there that's just being described? about the pandemic and who's at fault, if there has to be someone who's a scapegoat, and whether it's about jobs or any other issues where people have some lingering resentment or a hole in their heart, and someone else puts that toxic language in their consciousness. So it starts with how we think and how we're listening. So being aware of what's around us. How is pop culture representing Asians? There's a variety of shows now on Netflix and all the other different platforms, and it shows that everybody has a different experience, whether they had immigrant parents or they came as first generation or English as a second language. So really understanding that one type of Asian doesn't represent all types of Asians. And then interrupting that kind of thinking, not only in yourself, but if it shows up in other people's speech about, oh, ching chong chang, or on the playground in second grade, I had a classmate call me flat-faced Grace from outer space. And I share that because it's funny and it rhymes, and that's what kids do. But that shaped my identity as a person and me wanting a nose job when I was rich enough to get one so I could have a profile, because somehow not having a profile is something wrong. And so recognizing what are your throwaway comments that you might just put as an aside or an afterthought, and what space are you creating when you throw things out unconsciously or subconsciously. So you get to create a space in your sphere of influence. And when you say, well, there's so much happening, I can't possibly do anything, think about your own circle. How are you showing up for people? When those women were gunned down because of their business and they were manicurists, I got some very supportive texts, one from a college president, and it just said, thinking of you, because that kind of news hits really hard now because it comes almost on a daily basis. And now that I've actually accepted that I am part of this community and that I need to be present and do things as well, it makes it a harder emotional lift every day to actually sit in that reality. And one thing that I promised myself as I was doing this trauma work during the pandemic is the Asians are known for being stoic or shy or reserved or non-emotional. And that's why I'm showing up as an emotional person today, because that's really new for people to witness. And so that's a different Grace that other people aren't used to seeing. But when we're talking about things like hate crimes against Asian Americans, I need you to hear that intensity and that urgency in my voice and telling my family's story, because it's multiplied across the planet, not just here. And that's why 4.3 billion stories are out there. And if a person can stomp on a 61-year-old woman with everyone around them in New York City watching, and a security guard just closing the door with some casual indifference and turning their back on their neighbor and not seeing that person as a neighbor. So see people for who they are. Look around, notice differences, but embrace them and be present and ask, how can I help? How can I support you? You don't even have to use the word ally. Just, I want to know more. I want to listen. I want to learn. I want to lead.
Linda, could I respond to that
Please
quickly?
do.
And thank you, Grace. So my observation is dominant culture just likes to lump us together because it's just easier. So now you're just all Asian Pacific Islanders, which you are, but then there are unique cultures within that subculture. And then we're just all black folks, and then we're just all Latinx folks because we have some similarities, and it's just easier for them. That's the frustrating part. The part that I'm seeing now is that we are all being hurt, and we are stepping out of our silos. So now it's just not the AAPI group, which showed up and says, we know we need to march with our Black sisters and brothers. And now it's the Latinx group saying, you know, this is happening to us too. We need to show up collectively and let America know, you have got to stop hurting us. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because that is a new conversation that's happening in the communities of color, or how we should all be partnering together against this hate and this work that we have to do.
Thanks, Betsy. Wow. Well, just for the record, Grace, my friend, thanks for showing up with all that you are this morning. Appreciate that so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Linda. I always learn from you, and I looked forward to coming here because I got to see humans in real physical space instead of on Zoom.
Yes. Guillermo, the question that came for you was that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the BIPOC community, the Black, Indigenous, people of color community, and what can we learn from this pandemic about inequality in healthcare for minoritized groups? And what are the resources on the SCC campus, for example, for students who need healthcare? And I would say at this point, medical healthcare and emotional healthcare. So what can we do as a campus?
Thank you, Linda. I want to make sure to start out with the last question and point out the resources here on campus. We're fortunate enough to have the Student Wellness Clinic here on campus at SCC. Yes. It's actually a district function, so it serves both SFCC and SCC students. But it's located here on campus at the SCC campus over in Building 7 in the Jenkins Wellness Building. And it's open for students. They have a nurse practitioner that comes in who is able to prescribe medications, so that's an important aspect of healthcare. Yes. But they also house our mental health interns who are supervised by a mental health counselor, and it's all free. Yes. They do some stuff at the health clinic that costs minimally $5, $10, but a lot of the services are free for our students. And I always tell students, when we talk about free, just imagine if you're like me, you already paid for it. It's part of that tuition and fees, and just take advantage of that opportunity. And then it's also a great resource because if your doctor's maybe like mine and they're overworked and lots of patients, it's hard to get in. And our wellness clinic is a drop-in. Well, they're doing appointments now with COVID, want to make sure they know who's coming in. But it's pretty easy to get in there and see someone if you need some assistance.
Yes.
The other question was about what we've learned perhaps from the pandemic for our Black, Indigenous, people of color. One of the things I wanted to talk about today was if people are still confused or unsure about equity versus equality, this pandemic has really shown us that difference, because technically the vaccine and testing is free for everyone. But what we found out is that different communities of color, have been affected disproportionately, partly because of cultural backgrounds. There's places of worship, ways that we live, multi-generational households, people who work and are unable to take time off from work. They're dependent on someone going out to work and making money so that they can make rent. And they're not as fortunate maybe to be working from home or being able to take sick time if they're actually sick. And so when we talk about equality, we're saying, well, everyone has the opportunity here in the United States to work, and everyone has the opportunity to go see the doctor. Everyone has time off. And those are privileges that I think people don't recognize, especially with our communities of color. I know growing up, my parents didn't have sick days. They worked minimum wage jobs, never had time. If they wanted to take time off, they knew they weren't making any money, so they had to work maybe harder before or after. And so those are things that I think the pandemic has highlighted even more. And if you aren't noticing those things, then maybe checking the privilege that you live in and surround yourself with, because those things are happening in our communities. I brought some receipts, if you will, with just disproportionality with the pandemic. In Atlanta, Black patients with COVID-19 were more likely to be hospitalized than white patients. And they're talking about, out of 100% hospitalization, 79% of them were Black in Atlanta as far as hospitalizations with COVID-19. And then infection rates. In the US, the population, the Latinx population is 18%, but the case of infection was 29%. So we're talking about things that were highlighted during this pandemic. When we're talking about case infections, that results in more hospitalizations, more deaths. And so those things, even our local community, I was watching the news the other day, so if you got a chance to watch the news or read the article, a local news station started talking about the disproportionality between vaccines. In Spokane, there's 6% of the population in Spokane is Latinx, Hispanic. Only 3% of all the people vaccinated are Hispanic Latinx. So we're talking about less than half of the percentage. When we're talking about proportions, I'm not saying that half of the Hispanics are vaccinated. I'm saying that 81% of the population in Spokane is vaccinated, is white, when that equally represents 84% of the population in Spokane. So that's proportionate, right? We're looking at percentages being similar. So when we're saying 6% of the population in Spokane is Hispanic, but only 3% of the population in Spokane that are vaccinated are Hispanic, those percentages aren't the same. And so you can go and look at this information. It's on the CDC website. What can we do about it? I think there's a lot of education that goes with it, talking about the vaccine, talking about if you're sick, stay home, and what other resources the state is giving, the federal government is giving with unemployment. The state of Washington did put aside some money for our undocumented brothers and sisters so that they can also receive some stimulus money, because that was a population that was left out, was the undocumented population in the United States that didn't receive a stimulus money. Again, those are things that people have to consider when they consider, do I stay home from work? Do I take care of myself? Or do I have to go to work while I'm sick because I have to make sure that there's food, that there's a roof over my family? And those things affect us. And again, if you're not aware of this information, that probably might show that you're part of this privileged group of having to turn a blind eye or being able to. And research is free. That's the other thing I wanted to mention. You don't have to come to school to learn these things. You can research them. Google it. CDC website, check your local news stations. Those are reputable sources that you can find information about how this pandemic has disproportionately affected communities of color. And a lot of it is when we say, oh, we're equal, everyone is the same in this country. Things affect us differently, even from where you grew up. If you grew up in rural counties where healthcare isn't as available as it is in an urban setting, those things can affect how you receive healthcare, how you act towards your healthcare professionals. Are you receptive towards that information? And so just making sure that people are aware that when we're talking about equality versus equity, this pandemic has really highlighted that.
Thank you so much. Betsy, this is close to my heart. Recently, Speak Out we've adopted 12 years ago, Stevens Elementary School. And we do a poetry slam there every year. And of course, this year couldn't have the kids come over. It's their one field trip of the whole year from Stevens for the third graders. And we brought the poetry slam to them and each of their classrooms. And so we have a chance to see the kids in that school and see that school. Recently, I visited Hutton Elementary School. And it couldn't be more different. So the question that was asked to you is, if K-12 schools in our community are focusing on being more equity-minded, what steps are being made to even the playing field for students in poorer communities who might not have access to those resources? And I don't know if the city council has questions or things that they talk about regarding the schools, because I know a lot of it has to do with the Spokane Public School District, but it's certainly a piece of the issue.
Thank you, Linda. And
you're welcome.
when you paused, when you said Stevens Elementary in Hutton,
Yes.
I can pause and say elementary schools located further up on the South Hill,
Yes.
and then Grant and Sheridan.
Yes.
So at the one school, they have the latest technology available. You would think it was a private school.
Yes.
And then you go down to the inner city, and they barely have the essentials. So one thing, speaking first from government, that we can do to change that is home ownership. Everybody in Hutton lives in a house.
Yes.
And they're anchored, and they're not moving maybe 1 or 2 times a year from rental property to rental property. So they have no stability. When I was speaking about the East Fifth Avenue initiative and home building, the principal from Sheridan Elementary and Lincoln Heights, who I had never met, reached out to me and said, "Betsy, our kids need homes." That is the most foundational thing we as a community can lean in together on, is giving those children a safe and stable place to be. And with home ownership comes wealth. This one fundraiser I was invited to at the elementary school, it was like $150 a plate to go and raise money for all their extracurricular activities. I'm thinking, okay, but other schools, like, we don't even have those activities. Like that one school still had Valentine's Day parties and Halloween parties because they have a powerful PTA, because they own their homes and they show up. So that's the first thing, is the most basic, is home ownership will be a game changer for many of our families. And I have to just interject here because it just fries me. When we talk about certain people, people of color are poor. Dominant culture is low income. So we got to change that narrative too.
Yes.
Because really, you look at it, we probably all poor. But it's the perception of then where the resources go and how people perceive that. Did you see me lean up? Now I got excited. So we have to look at that also. But I know the district has done a lot of work around equity, and so we have to look at our teachers and what is the recruitment and the training of our teachers, because they are shaping those little minds. And kids spend all day at school. I mean, breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. And parents just get them at night. As he was saying, they're working all the time. And COVID-19 really showed what people of color already knew. The gaps are huge. Yes. There is still urban broadband deserts in the city. That's just not rural. We all know that. So how are our kids learning? And their parents aren't even home to make sure they've even zoomed in for school. So then what other resources can we bear? And it cannot be a one size fits all. And I believe District 81 has finally learned that they're gonna have to be nimble enough, to be flexible enough that certain elementary schools will need additional supports, and that may include after school. And I'm waiting to hear if they're going to provide some type of summer school enrichment programs for this gap over the last year.
Yes.
So if we start there, but at least the problem has been elevated, so now it's not a colored people problem, it's a community problem.
Yes.
And that is the best place to start to advance those conversations.
Thank you. Scott, at the community college, we serve a diverse student population, and you taught here, and I got to teach with you, which was so exciting.
Yes.
What can teachers in higher education institutions do to create a more inclusive classroom climate? And how would this benefit our students?
Great, great. You know, that question and those both questions, really, they tie into what kind of atmosphere do we create in a classroom setting. And, you know, you'd be surprised, the word educate is taken from a Latin phrase or Latin word, educare, which means to draw out. And so our first mindset has to be that we don't have students in front of us to tell them how to think or to interject something, but actually to draw out what's already inside, and then to help them articulate it, help them to define it, help them to center it on something that would eventually help others. And so the other question is too, what is education? But also, what does it mean to say that you're here to be an educator, to be one who draws out? We have to be willing to ask, and ask students to educate us. Students bring a lot to the table, and we need to give their narrative a founding place and a place of a sounding board. And so I think of about 4 questions in relation to this matter of asking and this matter of what is real education. And then I think the key, of course, all of this before I go to the 4 points, is that educators need to learn how to listen. There's a big difference between hearing and listening. I think in Washington, D.C. right now, they hear a lot, the D's and the R's, but there's not much listening, maybe even on city council, but I won't go there right now. So in light of that, this matter of listening is much deeper than hearing, because listening demands that you drop your perspective and take on someone else's perspective as valid. And that's what educators, I feel, really need to do, mindset-wise, is to realize I'm in a setting where I can actually draw out, I can actually learn from them, and then I can put together something that articulates a direction for the whole classroom. So the first question I would ask is, and I do ask when I'm in front of my classes, is there another way to look at what I just talked about? For instance, you talk about the roaring 20s, great financial boom kind of time. But is there another way of looking at it? And of course, some of us may know, yeah, not everybody was making a lot of money back in the 1920s. And actually, if you went to Harlem, you met up with a group called the Harlem Renaissance, who were actually making up a subculture that was not only one in which they could navigate through oppression and systemic oppression, but they could actually flourish in self-expression. They could flourish without showing deference to the majority. And so there was this little subculture going on that had nothing to do with a lot of money, but it sure did enrich a lot of people, and eventually the whole American culture took it up. The second question I would ask is there another viewpoint that's of worth? You know, it's one thing to say, is there another viewpoint, but to add the matter of worth. Because there you're framing it in the idea of this one statement in this chapter, in this book, about the New Deal, for instance, is it really the final story? And can we add another narrative to it besides the master narrative? And so I think to equate that with some value is a big thing. And then thirdly, I think the next question would be, how does your lived experiences and your inherited viewpoint from your family upraising, how does it vary or differ, or in a sense contrast or even similar? And so when we ask people about their lived experiences, now they're the expert, and now we've given the control over from the professor to the student. And I think that will turn into some sense of ownership for students. That's our class. That's not just his class that I'm taking or her class that I'm taking. And then lastly, I think the other question is, tell us your story and educate us. And I think if we can create an environment where these kind of questions are going on, in that sense, the diversity within the classroom setting will be seen as a strength and not a liability, as an asset and not a loss. And then when it comes to students, what will they gain in that kind of setting? I see 5 points. First of all, number one, they'll pick up a sense of validation. Everyone wants to be validated. The young and the old all want to be validated. And even some students will end up dropping out of school and joining gangs because of validation. But if we can validate them in that academic setting, I tell you that will go a long way to their retention and graduation rates. The second question, or the second point I think that students will gain, is that they will see their experience is not marginalized, but is authenticated and is legitimatized. And you know, it's always us against them, or them and us. But to see a sense of legitimacy in my experience in a classroom setting, all of a sudden there's more us and not them. And that's a big point. And then thirdly, I think students can benefit by being broadened and actually to see that differences, like I mentioned earlier, are a strength to this country. And e pluribus unum, out of many one, is a reality, at least in this safe space, as Grace, you mentioned, that we co-create in the classroom setting. And then number 4, I think the most strongest benefit that will come out is that students will end up as critical thinkers, because as you're watching and listening to someone else's story, you're beginning to understand that there's a broader thing going on out there, and you're not the only person that sees things and has, you know, kind of a sense of what's going on in the future for this country. And I think if we could have folks come to a point of it's not what happened, but why did it happen, and get into the whys and make people critical thinkers, this will turn, I think, into an electric kind of setting and atmosphere. And then lastly, the idea of what a student will benefit is self-worth and dignity by being in a classroom setting that isn't one way, that is actually, I would say, a diverse perspective setting rather than just using the word diversity. So we have to authenticate folks, legitimatize them, draw them out, help them articulate where they're going, and in a sense, take that beloved community that's created in that classroom setting and encourage them to take it out to society, take it out back home, take it out to where you hang out with people. And that will change things much more than any legislation,
Yes.
than any type of new leader. We need to start it at the grassroots level. And the hope in the future are the students that we stand in front of.
You bet. And my students are looking forward to having you come and talk to our intercultural class, too.
You bet. I'm looking forward to it.
Betsy, you had a
Hey,
comment?
Linda, thank you. So, as educators, I think the conversation, community folks, the evolution of educators, and because they are on that continuum, and we got, I would just say, old school educators and new ones, and they're kind of all mixed in, and there's no consistent messaging when we're educating our students. I'm talking K through 12 and higher ed. So what is the role, or how is the community colleges or higher ed looking at that mix of rolling off old way of educating and embracing new way of engaging students? And I'm sorry, Laura, you could just take that and run with it. Whoever.
Yeah, she's headed that way too, and I think that's a really relevant question. As that it's not just about the students, it's about the educators too. So Lori, what can higher education institutions do to protect students of color during these racially charged times? and what can higher education do to really have an inclusive atmosphere and environment where every single student feels like they're a valuable part of a community.
Thank you, Linda. I think we fear what we don't know, and we fear who we don't know. And so I think that education is an opportunity to learn from each other, but it is our role as faculty, staff, administrators to really support each other and to support our students, to continue discussions, to talk, to learn more about our lived experience and honor those lived experiences because, as you can see from our panel, we're all so very different, but we all have a lot of the same challenges that we're facing, especially right now during this pandemic. And so just opening that communication and having meaningful, tough conversations like our conversation today. It's always difficult, but they need to happen. And I think specific to SCC, it's everyone's job to create a safe and healthy learning environment. And so, for our students, for each other to continue to be able to do this work and champion the students, which means that we have to be aware of our individual biases and understand how to move through those so that we can support students. And so our campus diversity, equity, global awareness committee, the SCC equity plan, we have a lot of things that are getting a lot of momentum during this time, and we're excited to continue implementing tools like the intercultural development inventory. It's an assessment that helps us understand where we are with our intercultural learning, but then it also gives us kind of a pathway, but it gives us an opportunity to really look at our monocultural mindsets and work towards moving to intercultural mindsets. And so, opportunities for tools like that within across the campus, our leadership teams, we have book clubs, we're talking, we're having these discussions, if you will, at the top, and we're continuing to see how we can impact these changes within the institution. Continued trainings through our Teaching and Learning Center for our faculty have been so important because, again, it's that awareness. It's understanding the correct narrative and then being able to, make those changes in the classroom, instruction-wise, make those policy changes, and continue to support education. But I think the next step for us is really to continue looking at ways to be proactive, because so often we wait, we react, we see things happening, and now we've got to come up with a statement, or we got to move here. But we really need to be more focused on how do we make sure that we're prepared for whatever happens. So I think, again, by educating ourselves and being more involved in understanding social justice issues and those conversations, thinking about those best practices, that's how we can best be prepared to support our students. And so I know Guillermo was going to share a little bit more about what we're doing specifically for students from the student side. And so I just wanted to cover more of that administrative instructional staff side.
Go, Guillermo.
So we've opened up, here on campus at SCC, we've opened up the Center for Inclusion and Diversity, which is a brand new space dedicated to our students and some of their needs, as far as it houses our global education department, our multicultural student services department, and then also our Pride Center. So we want to make sure that it is a focal point to our campus to include people from diverse backgrounds and have a space where we can communicate about issues, talk about it. But like Lori said, we're hoping that it's the starting point and not the end point. So we want it to be a place where people can feel like they can be themselves and have conversations, but also how do you take that back to the classrooms? How do you take that back to the dinner table? We've been helping out with the Hagen Center Diversity Speakers Series that was started this year, to make sure that, again, those conversations are not just happening in the classrooms or at the Center for Inclusion and Diversity, but that you can take them home, have those conversations with friends and family, and really engage in those conversations, share something new with people. And I think a lot of learning happens outside of the classroom, and so that can be a space for students as well to continue that learning aspect.
And I guess I just kind of want to respond to Betsy's question earlier, or comment. I've been with the community colleges for going on my 10th year. So I've seen the challenges across campus with maybe some seasoned ways of thinking, if that's a good way to say it, and seeing the shift of the students that we have coming in and the hunger and the desire to learn more and to communicate better. And we have wonderful communication programs to help our students understand that communication. But I think we have our own internal barriers. You know, we have things that stop us from being able to do what we need to do to support each other and to support our students, and we're working through that. And I've seen a great progression in the 10 years that I've been here. So I'm very hopeful that we are going to be able to, you know, continue to, you know, I don't want to say arm our students, but really give everybody the tools that they need to be successful in, you know, a global economy, but also just to have these conversations and know that we are all willing internally to look at ourselves and think, how do we need to, you know, change the way we're thinking about things, or, you know, help people understand those different ways of thinking. So,
what a wonderful way to spend a morning. And I'm just so grateful for all of you coming and sharing your cultural stories and answering student questions. That they're going to be so excited to see this, because they got to answer, you know, come up with a lot of the questions and all. And for all of those who are seeing this video, we'll continue to talk about these kinds of issues, and we'll be doing that in classrooms, and we'll be doing that in meetings. And we're very delighted that you could be here and this crucial conversation about racial equity. So thank you all so very much. Here's to you. Yay.